Recording.
There you go.
All right, I'm just going to introduce you really fast. So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the final session of this year's High School Climate Change Symposium. Our speaker for this session is Dr. Tessa Hill. Dr. Hill is a professor at College of Letters and Science at UCDavis in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. Hill's work has been featured in a variety of mass media outlets. Her research interests include climate change, both past and present, and understanding the response of marine species to environmental perturbation. Tessa leads an industry academic partnership to understand the consequences of ocean acidification on shellfish farmers on the Northern California coast and currently serves on the Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Board. Everyone, please feel free to put your questions in the chat and they'll be answered at the end. This session is being recorded. And Dr. Hill, go ahead, start your presentation.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Let's see if we can pull this up. And will someone let me know if that looks right, like you're looking at my first slide?
Yep, looks perfect.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much and good afternoon. I really appreciate the organizers of this symposium. I've been listening in all morning. I'm on the West Coast, so morning for me. And I've been really enjoying the presentation so far. I'm honored to be part of this. Today, I'll be talking a little bit about how the ocean is changing due to climate change and fundamentally what we gain by observing the ocean and maintaining our own connection to it. My talk today will be structured into three parts: observation, storytelling, and connection. In the first part, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the research in my own lab, and then move to a story about the ocean and people who know it really well. But I'd like to pause here and take this opportunity to ask you all to think about a time that you felt really connected to the ocean. Perhaps a time you visited the coast, or something you read or learned or watched that made you feel curious about the sea and connected to the watery parts of our planet. I'm just going to pause so you can think about that. And I'm hoping at the end of the talk, we have time for people maybe to share what their answer to this question was. So, centered on our connections to the ocean, I am going to start on the observation component of this talk. And I'm going to start with a quote by Rachel Carson. Many of you might be familiar with her most famous book. It's called Silent Spring. Sometimes it's cited as an inspiration for the launch of the environmental movement in the United States. The publication of this book over 60 years ago was a major milestone for the US environmental movement. It called upon scientists and the public at large to address what she felt was the largest threat to the natural world at the time: the industrial scale pollution associated with chemical contaminants. In fact, in addition to and prior to this foundational work in science, she was a scientist, a naturalist, and a keen observer of the ocean. She was also a weaver of great stories, and she used narrative to bring people in closer connection to the ocean. She started with her first book, Under the Sea Wind, in 1941, and she continued this use of storytelling throughout her whole career. So I've included a quote from her here to get us started. I believe that the more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we will have for destruction. You'll see that I'll highlight a quote from her again, kind of in the middle of the talk. I'm going to highlight another author, a more recent author, towards the end of my talk. So this part of my talk begins with a multi-year field project that my colleagues and I started over 10 years ago. We were sampling water chemistry at 50 beaches up and down the US West Coast, trying to understand subtle mosaics and how the coast might be responding to climate change. This project has a particularly special place in my heart because my husband and I brought our young children along with us for this field work. So we have a lot of family memories of being on beaches just like this one in Southern Oregon, trying to understand the place and its oceanographic setting. And as a cool side note, this picked photo has masses of velella washing ashore. These are also called by-the-wind sailors. They're kind of like jellyfish. They're a hydrozoan, and they float at the sea surface, and they're known as sort of a sign of warm waters. So when they wash ashore, we sit up and we take note that the waters may be warmer than normal. And in fact, starting in 2013, a remarkable marine heat wave spread throughout the Pacific, right in the middle of us doing this field work. Over the next 3 years, we observed elevated sea surface temperatures, changes and closures in fisheries, what we could catch and eat from the sea, and dramatic impacts on the distribution and health of marine life. And during this time, my colleagues and I started to wonder, there's so much ocean data being collected all the time, and yet it's really difficult to find it all in one place and even look at it in comparison to different data sets. We knew that there's at any given time, there's buoys, there's field sites, there's research cruises going out and taking measurements of temperature or oxygen or chemistry, but it was impossible to actually visualize all these data in one place. And we recognized that that siloing of data sets, not having things easily accessible, was making it hard to respond and adapt to this ocean that was changing right before our eyes. So today in my talk, I'm focusing on a few ways that the ocean is changing. This image, I like this image because it's busy and it shows us that the ocean is changing in a lot of different ways. And that's kind of one of the points I wanted to make, which is that I'm going to tell you about just a couple of ways that the ocean is changing. But when we think about marine organisms that we care about, whether they're dolphins or sea otters or things we like to eat, like oysters, mussels, and clams, all of those things are contending with a lot of different things changing all at once. In today's talk, I'm really going to focus on this lower left-hand corner in terms of ocean chemistry change. So I'm going to talk about how the temperature of the ocean is changing, but also the inorganic carbon chemistry of the ocean and the oxygen of the ocean. You might have heard about decreasing oxygen or expanding hypoxic zones. So for a minute, in particular, this talk is really going to focus on that carbonate chemistry, the ocean acidification part. So I do, in case you haven't heard about that, I wanted to just introduce you. Perhaps you've heard about this in classes. We're through human activities, we're emitting a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And actually, one of the other speakers earlier today also talked about this idea that we put lots of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but the terrestrial biosphere and the ocean actually take up a lot of that carbon. So in the case of the ocean absorbs about 25 to 30% of the carbon that we put into the atmosphere. You can think of it as a tremendous service that the ocean is doing for us, because if that wasn't happening, the effects of the temperature change in the atmosphere would be far more dramatic than they are today. But the ocean is actually physically absorbing that carbon dioxide. And the absorption of that carbon dioxide fundamentally shifts the inorganic chemistry that's going on in the seawater. We also call that carbonate chemistry. And for those of you who love inorganic chemistry, I've even included some of the chemical reactions here on the slide, but you don't really need to know that. All you really need to know is that the ocean is becoming more acidic than it used to be. What we know, and I'll show you a few examples in a few slides, is that organisms that have evolved over millions of years in an ocean of a particular chemical composition are now struggling to thrive in an ocean where that chemistry is changing due to our carbon dioxide emissions. So when we think about the ocean changing, in particular in today's talk, I'm going to be talking about temperature increasing over time, which you can see on the left-hand graph, pH declining over time. That's the ocean becoming more acidic, and that's plotted in anomaly, so change over time in the middle. And then the amount of oxygen in the ocean water also declining. And you may have heard about this, that there are these sort of low oxygen zones in the ocean that are expanding and taking up even more space than they used to. So like I said, lots of different things changing at once, and these are the three I'm going to tell you about or show you some of our data on today. So in early on in this project, a group of us, 3 different research groups actually got together, and we were like, let's see what happens if we just put 3 different research groups' data on ocean chemistry onto one map. So this is a map of the surface pH of the ocean along the US West Coast. And the main thing I want you to take away from this is that it's like a mosaic of variability. The ocean is not the same from one place to another. And so even just these 3 data sets gave us a hint of how powerful it might be to pull together multiple layers of ocean observations. So we pulled 3 data sets together, including those 50 beach sites that I told you about just a few slides ago where I had my kids in tow. That data's in this map. So what we learned from doing this, even in a preliminary way, is the ocean is not a vast blue blanket of one condition. It's actually tremendously variable. It's like patchwork quilt, where different patches of water have different conditions, and those patches are sort of washing up against the shore. And so if you're an organism living in one place, you might be experiencing very different chemical conditions than the organism that's living 50 miles away. So our collaborative team, which I'm going to introduce you to in just a minute, felt like, well, this is really exciting. It's kind of a natural laboratory. There's lots of variability, so we can understand how organisms have adapted to these conditions over time. But also we thought, well, wow, how powerful, because a lot of how we adapt to climate change and develop solutions to climate change will actually be at a local level. So if we could know the way that the ocean is responding to climate change at a local level, it enables us to make decisions at that scale. So if you're working for a state or federal agency trying to decide how to manage fisheries, or you work for a sustainable shellfish group trying to decide where to site their next shellfish farm, that variability gives you windows of decisions, right? Because the ocean is not the same everywhere. So we knew from our own laboratory studies that we did at Bodega Marine Lab that these processes are becoming increasingly important. So over the past decade and a half, we have focused on widely distributed species along the US West Coast, including things that we love to eat or visit while we're along the shore, or maybe they have significant cultural or commercial value. Those are things like oysters, mussels, urchins, and gastropods, including abalone. And if you've never been to California, you may never have eaten an abalone, but I hope you get to come sometime and consume this local, extremely charismatic snail of the ocean that people love to eat. So what we found in these laboratory experiments is that in general, these shelled organisms had slower shell growth, smaller and weaker shells. They're more susceptible to predators or crashing waves, and that even rising CO2 or changing chemistry of the water change the behavioral responses of predator and prey. So these chemical conditions were fundamentally changing the way organisms could build their shells, could protect themselves, and how they interact with other organisms along the shore. And it gets even sort of deeper or maybe shallower, as the case may be, because when we look at the organisms that are drifting around in the surface of the ocean, forming essentially the base of the food web, or maybe the second step of the food web, and I've given you 3 examples here: tiny floating snails, single-celled foraminifera, and copepods, which are like little tiny shrimp. In every case, those rising CO2 concentrations or changing chemistry of the ocean has detrimental effects on these things that are what feed the salmon, the sea otters, the whales, things that we're really used to seeing along the coast. So our sort of overarching question for this research was, what are the spatial patterns of ocean acidification, oxygen, and temperature change for the US West Coast? And what I'm mostly going to tell you about is sort of the left-hand picture here. Like when we stick a measuring device in the ocean, what do we see? But I want you to keep in mind the connections to things that we love to eat or enjoy along the coast. I have Dungeness crab here and clams. So any ways that the ocean is changing the experience of the ecosystems, and of course then is changing our connection to the ocean too. So I do want to highlight that this was a big team science adventure. So I want to acknowledge lots of people who worked on this research with us. And I'm going to actually be able to specifically highlight a few of these people and their work in just a few slides. But mostly what I want to point out is lots of people working on this together. There's actually 3 universities represented in this research project, as well as a boundary organization that sort of sat between university researchers and policymakers so that our results would be taken up directly into the policy realm. And I'm going to come back to that and tell you some ways that this work did connect to decision makers right away. Okay, so our goal here was to try to understand the big spatial patterns of ocean chemistry, hypoxia, and temperature change. It seemed simple enough, right? What our stated goal was is that we're going to pull together all of the publicly available oceanographic data from buoys, research cruises, shore-based sampling. If it was out there in the public eye, we're pulling it into one platform. Over 5 or 6 years of working together, we amassed about 14 million observations from over 65 different field-based studies that are ongoing on the US West Coast. So this map on the left just shows you simply the location where temperature is being monitored along the US West Coast of the ocean. Let me tell you some of the things we found when we pulled these 14 million observations together. One thing we found is that you can develop an idea of just where are we looking at the ocean and when. So a simple question might be, are we doing a good job of monitoring the ocean across that whole geographic range? And so these figures along the left are plotted by latitude. So on the y-axis, for example, for temperature, the top end of that axis would be Washington State. And when you go down that y-axis, at the bottom end of the axis would be the border of California and Mexico. So we can look at how things are being measured across latitude and then also through time. So this data plots from, let's see, I think about 1985 to the year 2020. And you can see there's a couple of interesting observations that you can make pretty quickly. I love this question in the chat. Yeah, how do you process 14 million observations? Great question. We're doing it all in, all of my students are either using R or Python as a programming language, and you do have to have computing systems that actually can manage that level of data. But believe it or not, there's a lot of scientists that work with that many data points, and people call this big data science sometimes. So it's definitely possible, but you can't do it in like Excel or Google Sheets. It's too many data points for those those programs. Great question. I'll just point out a few interesting things about this. One is that we get a sense that we are, first of all, we're not monitoring temperature, dissolved oxygen, and chemical carbonate system evenly across the coast. There are some places that we take a lot more measurements than others. And you also can really see when people began to be worried about ocean acidification, because we literally weren't monitoring for it at all until the early 2000s. And then people start putting instruments into the water. And I'm going to answer Elijah's question. So we were not physically collecting all this data. What we were doing was finding all the data that 65 different research teams were putting out on the web in portals or in papers. And we were saying, let's put all this data in one place. So some of these data sets we are actually responsible for. So there's probably 5 of the 65 that my research lab actually collected the data. But all of the other data sets, what we did, we were the people who pulled everything together in one place. So there's 60 other research teams out there right now doing work like this, contributing to a plot like this. The other thing I'll mention, because it's going to come up in one more slide, is in sort of a different way, but unfortunately, the peak of observations in terms of how well we spatially covered the coast occurred in 2015. So we are actually monitoring the US West Coast for these climate change parameters less today than we were 10 years ago. It's hard to believe, but all of these monitoring programs are dependent upon state and federal funding. And as federal funding waxes and wanes, in particular, we have years where science is funded really well by the federal government and the years that it's not. You can essentially see major research programs sort of, turn on in this data set and then flicker off when they lost funding. So unfortunately, I've been taking this talk around to many different people, trying to convince them, like, we have a problem because the ocean is changing faster than at any point ever right now. And we do not have enough eyes in the water to be able to keep track of that change. Great questions. I'm going to keep trying to answer them as we go. But let me show you some other things that we learned. So this is an actual plot of real data, not just where the data are coming from, but actual data. So this time we've plotted the temperature for Washington, Oregon, Northern Central California, and Southern California. And each of those purple data points is an actual measured point within what we would consider sort of near shore, within about 30 kilometers of the shore. And so in some places, there's so much data that those purple dots superimpose on each other, and it looks like a solid purple block. But that's literally because there are thousands of data points in those blocks. I love this question, Kylie. I'm going to come back to it because I think it's a really good question. And it's a little bit the theme of my talk, like, why bother, right? So great question. I'm not ignoring you. Hopefully I'm going to answer that question as we go. Okay, so there's some interesting things we can see from this. One, I'll just point out that the sort of timing of extreme conditions. So in terms of temperature, if we were concerned about organisms along the coast, we're mostly concerned about warm temperatures, not cool temperatures. And so, we can look at these data and see when those extreme temperatures are happening in each of these regions. And we could do the same thing for pH. So I'm now going to pull up a pH plot on the right-hand side. It's plotted the exact same way. So Washington, Oregon, Northern California, and Southern California. And this time you're actually looking at the pH of the ocean. You can make a couple of observations. One is that we have much less pH data. You can see that because you can see a lot more of the individual green points rather than them all glomming onto each other, looking like a purple block or a green block. You see the individual points. And one of the interesting things is that we can also point out the times where the lowest pHs are already occurring. And so where organisms are going to see those most stressful conditions in terms of ocean chemistry. And some other time, if I had another hour to tell you all about how the oceanography of the West Coast works, I could tell you why this is. But one of the things I'll tell you is the interesting thing is that we see those extreme heat events and those extreme low pH events occurring broadly in the same season. They're not actually happening at the exact same time. They're happening because the ocean is actually oscillating between two extremes. But for an organism along the shore, what we learn from this is that we have to be worried about an organism like a mussel or a sea urchin or fish or dolphins or sea otters. What they are seeing is this oscillation from one extreme state to another, not necessarily overlapping, but sequential stressors. And that actually is really important for biologists who are trying to understand, the physiology of organisms and how they adapt to conditions like this. So this has a lot of data on it, and I want you to don't get overwhelmed by all the points. I'm gonna kind of walk you through what it means and what it looks like. But this was an exciting study where my colleague Sarah was able to take this data set and ask the question, well, what's happening in the most protected areas along the coast in California specifically? So all of these data come from within 10 kilometers of a marine protected area, which is basically a marine park that is established by the state. and that park restricts fishing and other uses that might be of a stress to the environment. But of course, marine parks cannot protect us from climate change, right? Climate change is everywhere. It's an overarching stressor, regardless of how we protect these organisms in other ways. And so Sarah was curious about how often organisms within those protected areas would see stressful conditions. And what she's plotted here in each of these little scatter plots, pH is on the y-axis and dissolved oxygen is on the x. And then if there is a temperature anomaly, so like warmer or cooler than normal conditions, that's plotted in the colors. And she then has placed those little red lines to guide you around when conditions are stressful for organisms, specifically for invertebrates. So I'm not talking about fish and marine mammals in this slide necessarily. But anytime you see data fall below the red dashed line, or to the left of the red dashed line, or a combination of the two, organisms in that place are seeing conditions that are stressful from what we understand in the literature. So it's using these data, we can see clear evidence that inside even the most protected places along the California coast, climate change is still bringing stressors, not a huge surprise. Some of these marine parks are experiencing conditions in terms of temperature or chemistry that are already stressful for marine organisms, and they will worsen in the future. But the most startling of all, and you've sort of heard me say something like this before, is that in most of these marine parks, we aren't monitoring at all. We were able to do this analysis in only 9 of the 124 marine protected areas in California because the others just don't have enough data to even conduct the analysis. So the majority of these places that are the most protected marine coastal sites in California, we actually have no idea how climate change is proceeding. Okay, I'm going to come back to that because it actually kind of gets to Kylie's question in the chat box. But I did want to just show you, because this is another cool sort of connection to the terrestrial world. We're using this giant data set to understand how ocean chemistry is being impacted by terrestrial processes. So we can plot data like this from terrestrial river and stream sensors and understand how decisions we make on land, for example, about agriculture, the use of fertilizers, land use change, pollution, that all those things might impact the water chemistry right along the shore. And so by connecting this big data synthesis of oceanographic data to what we know about stream flow and chemistry of the waters that are flowing from land, we actually might be able to make some decisions, some good decisions about how to protect rivers and streams and protect the coastal ocean too. So in summary, what I wanted to tell you about this sort of big synthesis project is that it gives us a tremendous potential to understand sort of regional, site-specific, and even time-based trends in how the chemistry of the ocean is changing. I pointed out a few places to you where data gaps are a really clear limitation. In a lot of places, we simply do not have our eyes on the ocean enough to even be able to tell you what's happening. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this in the next few slides, but we are really striving to connect these oceanographic observations to other systems. So for example, the terrestrial river and stream system, or to what we understand about the marine biosphere. So how are organisms impacted by these changes? But I also wanted to tell you, and I hinted about this at the beginning, that how we have connected with people who would immediately use these data to make the decisions that they're trying to make about, sustainability along the coast. And so, I have a picture here of folks in coastal California heading out to go crab fishing. This is a really important commercial fishery in California. A lot of cultural value, but also a lot of economic value. And so we need to be able to understand, how do we change the way we fish so that it's sustainable in a changing ocean when the ocean is changing as well, right? So the first thing we've done is all these data are open for anyone to use. I didn't really mention this in the talk, but I'm happy to send any of you how to find it. It's a public data set. Anyone can access it, query it, and use it. But we've also been working with a federal agency to get it up on a public portal so that it's easy to use. So you don't have this problem of, I have 14 million data points and it's going to crash my computer. It's going to be put on a portal where you can map, layers and data sets, using someone else's computing time, essentially. So that's exciting. We've had several federal and state agencies already use the data, including the National Marine Sanctuaries, the California Marine Protected Areas, and the National Park Service, as ways to try to use data to inform their management of the coast. We've been working with conservation groups that are working on restoration of threatened species. So a real tangible example of this is that if we're going to restore species and try to return them to habitats, maybe an endangered species or a threatened species, we want to know that the habitat we're placing them in is not a stressful one. And so you might use these maps to actually predict where is an ideal place to do your restoration project. We've also worked pretty extensively with tribes in both Oregon and California that are using the data for their own resource management on their tribal lands. And we've been working with members of the sustainable aquaculture industry, so these are the shellfish farmers, for them to be able to use the data, again, to think about where might you site a shellfish farm so that today and 20 years in the future, or 50 years in the future, it's a place where that business is successful and sustainable. So I wanted to make that point because sometimes we don't connect the dots about how science is used, and we've been working really hard on making sure this science is used. The other thing I wanted to mention before I move on to a story, which kind of addresses Kylie's question, is that this first question that I just described to you today is actually part of a 3-part project, and all parts are linked together. The first, which we just talked about, is can we describe the spatial patterns of this chemical change in the ocean? The second question is, where are key species that we are worried about vulnerable to those overlapping stressors? So actually developing some maps that would show where species that we are worried about, where are they vulnerable to these climate change stressors today and in the future? And then the third part is really the human connection. So how are coastal communities adapting to this change? And so there's a part of our team that are social scientists, and they are doing this work through interviews of coastal communities, thinking about how they are adapting to the way that the ocean is changing, and the way that it changes our connections to the ocean, including a sustainable source of food. Okay, so this then gets to the question, which I sort of predicted someone might ask, because I think it's a really valid question, and I think students actually ask me a lot when I talk about this work, like, why bother observing the ocean today? It's changing so much and it's changing so fast. Like, what is the purpose of making basic observations about the ocean anymore? Could our time be better spent elsewhere is a really good question. And I probably can't answer exactly that question, but I did want to tell you a story about how powerful observation and archiving of information can be for future generations. And before I start that story, I did want to center us again with some wise words by Rachel Carson. One way to open your eyes is to ask yourself, what if I had never seen this before? And what if I knew I would never see it again? So just thinking about that in the context of what we observe in the ocean. And I'm going to tell you a little story. So this story starts with and centers around this paper that was published in the 1990s. If you ask many marine scientists today or oceanographers today what paper or papers opened their eyes to the shifting landscape that we face due to climate change, many of them point to this paper by Jim Barry, Chuck Baxter, Rafe Sagarin, and Sarah Gilman. But the truth is that the origin of this paper actually begins much earlier than the 1990s. In 1931, so almost 100 years ago, a young scientist named Willis Hewitt arrived in Monterey, California, so Central California. He was pursuing his PhD. He came to California at a time of great significance. So you might recognize some of these, in terms of literature that you've read in school. This was, the time period of Steinbeck's Cannery Row and major biological discoveries by Ed Ricketts. And inspired by this sort of the grandfather of marine ecology, Ed Ricketts, Hewitt decided that he wanted to study the arrangement of animals in the tide pools in front of Hopkins Marine Station, which is the marine field station for Stanford University. So in 1931, he went out to this tide pool and he drove a series of iron bolts into the granite that formed the pool. For 3 years, he worked along this transect that was identified by these bolts, which I'll show you a picture of in just a minute. He counted and categorized what was living in the pools. He completed his work in 1935, filed his dissertation, and moved back to Texas to become a professor of biology there. He could not have known the message that he sent to future generations, the value of what we now know as baseline data. To understand this story, my colleague Eric Simmons and I went and met with Jim Barry, the lead author of that paper I referenced just 2 slides ago. And we shuffled through that exact tide pool in our own wading boots. Jim told us that in the early 1990s, his colleague, Chuck Baxter, mentioned to him that he felt like the tide pool had just started to look different. As though some subtle shift had taken a hold, the tide pool felt like it had a different color or content, something that Chuck just couldn't quite put his finger on. So the two of them started pitching a project idea to Stanford undergraduates. And they did this several years in a row. And these Stanford students, year after year, no one really wanted to follow the mystery of these tide pools until finally, one year, 2 students, Rafe Sagarin and Sarah Gilman, came along and decided, okay, this is an intriguing question. What's different about this tide pool today than before? So there was only one problem. No one could quite remember where Hewitt had put his transect lines down. So Hewitt had described the transect carefully in his work, but he did not include a sketch of the exact path of where he had done his research. So Sagarin, Gilman, Baxter, and Barry went into the tide pools to look for the bolts that he had driven into the granite. They had to go out at low tide in the middle of the night with lanterns, pushing piles of seaweed aside to try to find exposed rock. And they had metal detectors in hand to try to find these bolts. And they found them. So they were able to rediscover exactly where Hewitt had done his work in the 1930s. They found the bolts, and eventually during low tides that year, Gilman and Sagarin would lay down a 1-yard square box at each bolt, and they would count and identify every single thing within that box. By the end of the spring, they documented 58,000 individual animals. The next step was to compare what they had counted to the species and the positioning that Hewitt had described 60 years earlier. In their 1995 article, Barry, Baxter, Gilman, and Sagarin reported that the abundance of 8 warm water southern associated species had increased at the site, while 5 cold water species had decreased since 1935. I'm showing you some of those warm water associated species on the screen. The shift in assemblages coincided with measurements of water temperature indicating warming over several decades due to climate change. The lesson of the story was built on some of the smallest inhabitants of the tide pools, but it carried a big headline. Ocean observers did not have to wait any longer to document impacts of climate change because ocean species were already on the move. Other scientists working in other fields had started to try to grapple with the implications of global warming. And because the tide pool resurvey connected our present to our past, it landed with particular heft. But there's a side story I want to tell you that was going on at the same time. While the tide pool surveys were being discovered and rediscovered, there was another kind of discovery happening too. I now would like to introduce you to Linda Yamane. She is a member of the Rumsen Ohlone tribe from the Central California coast, what we now know as Monterey. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Linda went looking for an archive of notes about the Rumsen Ohlone language, songs, and traditions. Her grandmother told her stories, but she generally felt, at least she told us, that she didn't know very much about the Rumsen culture. And as she grew older, Yamane's curiosity about her own history increased. In 1985, someone told her that there was a local university library, San Jose State University, that had an archive of mostly untouched and unexamined Ohlone information. It was a treasure trove of information stored away there by an Ohlone woman named Isabel Meadows. She's pictured here. She worked with an ethnographer named John Harrington. Isabel Meadows was the last fluent speaker of the Rumsen language, and she worked with Harrington towards the end of her life to document language, stories, songs, and traditions. Meadows died in 1939. Her last years of being around the Monterey area would have overlapped with Hewitt's time there in the tide pools. It was surprisingly difficult for Linda Yamane just to get an appointment to see the archives at the university library. The librarians kept giving her conflicting information, but she eventually gained access to the archives left by Meadows and Harrington. During the same time period that the Hopkins scientists were pushing through the seaweed to try to find the bolts in the darkness, Yamane pushed through the darkness and uncertainty of that library search in looking for Rumsen knowledge rarely accessed since Meadows dictated it in the 1930s. Later, Yamane wrote about how she felt shy, saying her ancestors' words out loud. She would practice them late at night, sitting awake in bed while her family slept. From basic words, she moved to songs. She began talking to basket makers from other Northern California tribes, and she became the first Ohlone to weave an Ohlone-style basket in 150 years. Interested in the canoes in which the Rumsen navigated their watery world, she joined a group to build one of the first Thule canoes to ply the San Francisco Bay since the 1980s. Since then, she has built more than 30 Thule canoes. Several times now, she has paddled the canoes in the Great Tide Pool in front of Monterey Bay Aquarium, which is just a few hundred feet away from that tide pool transect that I told you about. She became an expert in working with shells to create beads used as decoration on baskets and for jewelry. She became an expert in where to find those shells, on what beaches, and how to treat them to create the material that would withstand jewelry making. When researching this story, we met with Linda over dinner in Monterey. She arrived wearing shell jewelry, of course, and she talked to us about the work it takes to find and revive a lost connection. She was the first of several people to tell us that it takes courage to keep watching a changing world. It takes tremendous foresight to record and document those observations. She sees herself as creating new beauty out of old knowledge. And that knowledge that Yamane gained is incredibly valuable. In the same years that Hewitt had spent recording one kind of message to the future, Meadows and several Ohlone elders gifted future generations the information they would need to revive their culture. Yamane and Barry and his colleagues were observant enough to know that lessons from the past can help us shape and understand the future. That even sometimes we don't know why we are observing, but that we hope that someone will pick up that archive like a message in a bottle and use it for good. The story that I'm telling you comes from the first chapter of a book that Eric Simmons and I published last month. We have worked on this book for about 6 years with the shared goal of helping people forge a stronger reconnection to the ocean. What Eric and I realized is that we can easily provide tangible examples of how events on land, things like drought, wildfire, storms, or unusually warm winters, are devastating terrestrial environments. But when we look out at the ocean, we see a vast expanse of blue Most people just don't see that those same scale of ecological events are happening in the ocean too. They're threatening ocean environments, but they are also threatening our human connection to the ocean. So this is where we get back to connection, which is what I asked you to think about at the beginning. Connection with each other and with the ocean is an overarching theme of the book. As you've heard from the other speakers today, a big antidote to the challenges we face with climate change is working together. Sometimes that means talking to our neighbors, talking about climate change, meeting other people who will work with us to make better decisions. I encourage all of you to think about how you're connected to the ocean and what we are committed to doing to keep it safe. This time, to end, I'm going to feature another quote from an author. Perhaps some of you have read work by Elizabeth Rush. She wrote a book a few years ago called Rising, which is about sea level rise. Her new book is The Quickening, and it visits the Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica to try to understand the implications of climate change for this critical area of the globe, which is facing unprecedented melting. She said in the Quickening, hold on, I want to read this. I think about those who left Paradise, California, the day it burned, about those fleeing devastating drought in the Middle East, about all the people who have already surrendered one definition of home for another, and hopefully for the promise of safety. I think about the Thwaites Glacier's grounding line, how it too is on the move, and how no amount of present-day mitigation will fuse it back to the land that it left. I am still trying to understand what the ice reveals by coming undone, what its disintegration asks of us. And I just want to note that Dr. Kimmerer asked us in her opening plenary, what does the earth ask of us? And I was so pleased to see this because without knowing this in advance, I had written a similar question on my slide. What does the ocean ask of us? What are we willing to do to protect that connection that we have to the ocean? Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate the symposium organizers for inviting me to be part of this. And of course, to the scientific team that contributed to the project that I presented to you. I hope you'll check out the book, and I'm going to stop share and we're going to do questions for a little bit.
I just want to say thank you so much. That the stories were so beautiful. And I think I mean, you hear all these facts all the time, but I think the stories really stick with you. And I think those are what's impactful, I guess.
Well, that's really interesting because so Eric and I, the book came out a month ago, and so Eric and I have been doing quite a bit of interviews and things like that about the book. And one of the things that people ask us is, why a book, and why will people who disagree with you on this topic, why will they pick up your book and read it? What will they get out of it? And I think the answer to that is exactly what you just said, which is storytelling is incredibly powerful. It's often more powerful than us showing people data. And because it connects us to other people. And so there's a lesson in that, which is that to address the challenges we are trying to address, to work with people who we may not agree on about everything, we actually have to build connections. And, storytelling is one way of doing that, which I think is what you just said.
Yeah, I'll be sure to pick up your book. I got that little bit of it. I'm I want to read the whole thing.
Yeah. Okay. So this is wonderful. Kylie, I'm hoping that you feel like I answered your question. If not, feel free to raise your hand. We can talk about it further. It's great. I'm getting some really lovely, general oceanography questions in the chat, which is fabulous. And I think I'm going to try to come back to those. I might first, I'm going to answer this question about ocean acidification, which is down at the bottom. Someone asks, what role does ocean acidification have on algae being able to create oxygen if they're not able to make shells? This is a really great question. So some of our phytoplankton, which are at the base of the food web, they're usually single-celled or very simple plants or plant-like organisms, algae. Some of those make shells and some of them don't. So actually, the ones that build shells out of calcium carbonate, like an oyster or a mussel, you would expect them to decline just like what we saw with oysters and mussels. And that has been shown in laboratory experiments. However, I mean, there's a couple of howevers. However, one point of however is that there's actually quite a few types of phytoplankton that either don't build shells like that or build it out of a different material. And so they might be impacted by other processes going on in the ocean, but they're not going to be impacted by ocean acidification. I guess the other caveat I would say is that those organisms that form the base of the food web have really fast generation times. They like live, reproduce, and die super, super fast. And so they actually have a lot of potential to adapt to a changing ocean condition compared to an organism that might live for 100 years and only reproduce, when it gets to be 20 or 30 years old. So you can imagine these organisms that are, sort of like weedy species, just like you see in your yard where they like bloom, reproduce, and die back, have a little bit more potential to adapt faster to the changing ocean conditions. And so even some of those organisms that make shells, they may not all be able to adapt, but there's a little more potential for that. Okay, another great question from Elijah. How did you coordinate citizen science when such a large team of researchers? So for the most part, the data sets that I showed you are not really from citizen scientists per se. They're mostly like large, university or federal agency research projects. Your question is still true, that we did coordinate a large team of researchers, and it happens in a lot of different layers. Like some of that coordination is done across that whole team of people that I showed you. We have big team meetings and we have a system of communicating. We use Slack a lot to communicate with each other. But a lot of that coordination is done in sort of subgroups. And so the group working on the oceanographic analysis and the group working on the ecological analysis and the group working on social science are all meeting as subgroups. And then we're like, we get together as a larger group. But it's definitely, it's a different kind of science than working in a lab where it's just maybe you and a professor or you and a mentor, where the two of you are making all the decisions. When you have 20 or 30 people on that screen, it's group decision time, and that's definitely a different kind of science. It's fun. I really enjoy it. I really enjoy those people. So I'm lucky to be surrounded by all those people. I will mention, since you asked about citizen science, that there are citizen science groups that are featured in the book that I was just mentioning. And part of the sort of the theme of the book is that we need to be able to value different types of ocean knowledge. And so we get ocean knowledge from Western scientists, but we also need to value and incorporate knowledge from fishermen, sustainable aquaculture growers, citizen scientists, indigenous communities, conservation groups. And we think about in the book, we think about sort of interweaving all of that knowledge together, so that we can make decisions based upon all of those different knowledge types and value all of those knowledge types. So I'm glad that you asked the question about citizen science. Let's see here. I'll go back and I'll do Tim's question. So really great question. The impact of the AMOC slowdown has on the movement of warm water and therefore thermal expansion leading to sea level rise. So this is like a big, complicated question. There probably isn't like a simple, easy answer to that. You are referring to the slowdown of Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which is the circulation system that sends water from the surface of the ocean, and it reaches particular temperature or saltiness that it's dense enough that it starts to sink, and it moves through the interior of the ocean. And so when we think about how the ocean is circulating, oftentimes what I tell students is that about the top 10% of the ocean is being moved around by wind and storms and things like that. And the other 90% is being moved around by this density driven circulation that moves water and heat and salt through the interior of the ocean. So it's kind of interesting because the majority of the ocean is actually by like volume, the majority of the ocean is being moved that way. And there is quite a bit of concern that due to melting ice in the North Atlantic, that the sort of heat salt balance in the North Atlantic is going to be thrown off, and that water that typically sinks in the North Atlantic, we will not sink as much or as fast as we have over many thousands of years. So, the rates of that sinking have been pretty stable for thousands of years, and now due to global warming, global climate change, those rates are changing. And so this is where I get to the part where there is actually not a simple answer to your question, because that sets off sort of a domino effect of a whole bunch of different impacts around the globe. I mean, we've sort of fundamentally changed the way we are moving heat and salt around the globe. And so you would then expect both changes right in the North Atlantic in terms of heat distribution, weather, and things like that in the North Atlantic, but also some knock-on effects of how that heat gets moved around the planet, and to your point, influences ice melt in other places. So I'm not sure that I can in 1 minute concisely answer exactly what's going to happen next, but that's why the reason why it's a concern for people is that it's sort of a fundamental system of how heat is moved around the planet, and that system seems to be wobbling, or we are concerned that it might be changing.
Okay, I think with that, we are out of time for the session. Dr. Hill, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with all of us. We really appreciate having you here. His amazing presentation. All right, everybody, thank you so much for coming to this year's High School Climate Change Symposium. The recording of this session and other sessions will be posted on our YouTube channel, which can be it'll be linked on our website. Yeah. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.